gosh, I love it when my sheer presence just brings you all to silence. I have to practice that more often, shan't I? Good evening, everybody. It is a wonderful, wonderful occasion always, the Sue Lloyd-Roberts lecture. And a very, very warm welcome to you to St Hilda's College, to the Jacqueline du Pré Music Building, and to our 2025 Sue Lloyd-Roberts lecture. As you probably all know, but I'm going to say it anyway, Sue Lloyd-Roberts CBE was a much admired alumna of the college, matriculating in 1970 to study history and modern languages. And this year passes the 10-year anniversary of Sue's passing. This evening, we're honoured to be hosting the 8th Sue Lloyd-Roberts lecture in her memory. And in parallel to the Sue Lloyd-Roberts lecture, we also have the Sue Lloyd-Roberts Fund. And since its establishment in 2017, the fund has enabled placements and internships for St Hilda students who wish to explore careers in the media. And I'm really delighted to report that this year the fund was able to support 2 students, and they're students from lower income families, and this has made an enormous difference to them and their ability to be able to go and explore future careers, following in Sue's footsteps, if you like. So on behalf of our students and all of us here at St Hilda's, a huge thank you for your generosity of support, and of course we'd be delighted if you would wish to give us anything today. I am thrilled, but not at all surprised, to see the JDP so full for this evening's Sue Lloyd-Roberts lecture, and I know that many of you are staying for our annual Burns Night dinner in the pavilion afterwards. 2025 is also the 30th anniversary of the opening of this wonderful building, and in celebration of which we've organised a very special anniversary season of musical and performing arts events. And please do have a look at our concert series. The brochures are available outside or online, and we'd love to have you back here at the JDP to enjoy one of these events. May I please now briefly introduce Sue's widower, Nick Guthrie, and thank him for identifying our wonderful speaker for tonight, Lindsey Hilsum. Welcome, Lindsey, and I'm greatly looking forward to your lecture. Nick, please make the introduction. Thank you so much.
May I start, first of all, by thanking you all for coming here today. Yes, I stand before you as the representative of my late wife, Sue Lloyd-Roberts, in whose memory we hold this, the 8th lecture, in a series of what I hope will be a reminder to us all of the importance of shining a light on the truly downtrodden in our world. Let's just remind ourselves of some of the areas of Sue's reporting. It included child slavery, honour killings, forced marriages, female genital mutilation, women's rights, children's rights, the death penalty. All are excused by cultural differences, and all Sue campaigned against. And, sadly, all ongoing issues even now. Then there was her investigative reporting: political corruption, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Russia, Romania, China, people smugglers, animal rights, climate change issues, the plight of Tibet, the crushed people of Burma. The list goes on and on. Sometimes she was dubbed the BBC's hopeless causes correspondent. But I think her reporting did make a difference to many of the downtrodden. And today? Well, today we live in very uncertain times, perhaps even a time of revolution. Never before has free speech and campaigning journalism been of more importance to our democracy. We need these men and women, journalists and commentators, to expose the lies we are told by those in authority. We need to have exposed the corruption that is all around us. We desperately need the fact checkers to expose the excesses of social media. So much for Mark Zuckerberg and Musk. And perhaps the most important of all, we need to demand an accountability by exposing wrongdoings and incompetent management. May I remind you, as the Prime Minister said recently, too many people in Whitehall are comfortable in the tepid bath of managed decline. And to paraphrase JFK, that you should choose change, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Sir Keith went on to say, I totally get it that when trust in politics is so low, we must be careful about the promises that we make. But across Whitehall and Westminster, that's been internalised as don't say anything, don't try anything too ambitious. Let's set targets that'll happen anyway. In other words, from another time, yes, Minister, but. In other words, too many of our authorities are not fit for purpose. And when the so-called levers of power are pulled by the ministers, nothing happens. So, to now and tonight. Well, one of our world's best and most experienced specialists in the art of telling us the real truth, of shining a blinding light into dark places, is our guest speaker. Lindsey Hilsum is Channel 4 News' international editor. I've watched her reporting for many years, and I can tell you, she is simply one of the best. Recently, she's reported on the wars in Gaza and Ukraine, and the return of the Taliban in Afghanistan. She's covered the major conflicts and refugee movements of the past 30 years, including Syria, Iraq, Kosovo and Rwanda. Tonight, she has chosen the title of her talk, Reporting in a Time of Revolution, from Damascus to Washington, D.C. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lindsey Hilsum.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nick, for those kind words, and thank you, Sarah. On Sunday, December the 8th last year, I was in Lviv in western Ukraine. I'd just spent a couple of weeks on the front line, and I was buying chocolate, because they have very nice chocolate there, and they have, you can buy them people for Christmas. And I was also buying Christmas decorations, because they run a very nice line in papier-mâché Ukrainian soldiers cuddling a cat, which you can hang from your Christmas tree. They're very popular. And I was pretty happy, and then my phone began to ring and to buzz, and I looked at it. Bashar al-Assad had fallen much more quickly than anybody had expected. Did I think, that's fantastic, the wonder for the Syrian people free from tyranny? Did I? Hell, I thought, shit, I'm in the wrong place. I'm in Ukraine, and I should be in Damascus. What am I going to do now? And then, of course, I went, as any journalist in the audience will understand this, then I went into, why am I always in the wrong place? Why have I always missed the story? Why is my career such a disaster? All of those things. Anyway, luckily for me, my colleagues were feeling similarly. So we got in the car to drive to Warsaw Airport. But instead of flying to London, we flew to Istanbul and to Amman, and then we went over the border to Damascus. So we got to Damascus by Tuesday. 2 days? Not too bad, is it? And then, of course, it was extraordinary, because witnessing a revolution like that, and I had been in Syria earlier on, it's just amazing. It's, Wordsworth's poem about the French Revolution, bliss in that dawn it was to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. And I was watching all these young people taking selfies. Selfie is a very important part of revolution these days, by the way, and, holding the flag and so on. And then I went to Homs, which used to be called the capital of the revolution, back in the early days in 2011, when people first rose against Bashar al-Assad. And of course, I thought of Sue, because Sue Lloyd-Roberts was probably the first journalist, I think, to get into Homs, to sneak into Homs, when part of it was being held by rebels and by protesters. And she went in disguised as the driver's deaf-mute sister. My God, she had nerves of steel. I always feel, wandering around the world, that I've got sort of journalist flashing above my head, because I can't really imagine being anything else. But Sue was absolutely brilliant at just, finding her way in, being whoever she needed to be to get the story. And I rewatched that story, and it was prophetic, because in the end, what brought Bashar al-Assad down was that his army wouldn't fight for him. They just wouldn't fight for him anymore. And she, all that time earlier, had interviewed soldiers who were defecting to the opposition. So you could see in that story the seeds of what was to come. And then I also thought about another of my predecessors, Marie Colvin. Marie was a Sunday Times journalist and one of my friends, and she was killed in Bab el-Amr in Homs in February 2012. And alongside her, a French photographer called Remy Ochlik, and they were killed by a rocket fired by Bashar al-Assad's army, the Fourth Army. And I wanted to go to where she was killed. And so I did that. Marie once wrote, "It has always seemed to me that what I write about is humanity in extremis, pushed to the unendurable, and that it is important to tell people what really happens in wars." I think that I report in a tradition. I try to report in a tradition. It's the tradition of Sue. It's the tradition of Marie. It's the tradition of Charles Wheeler, James Cameron, Martha Gellhorn, Lee Miller. And I would like to say that here today is someone who was a mentor to me in this, and that's Mike Wooldridge, who was the BBC East Africa correspondent back in the 80s when I was the stringer. And I learned so much from him, and Ruth Wooldridge, his wife, is also here, who's been a mentor to me in many other ways. So Syria was the perfect story for our kind of reporting, overthrowing of a tyrant. I went to the clock tower. Now, the clock tower was where all the protests happened at the early part of the revolution, and Sue filmed there. And that was where, everyone was celebrating now. And when I looked at my pictures, I noticed that I'd been there at about 11 o'clock in the morning, but actually the clock said 8:30. And I thought, it's taking them a while to catch up, because this, in the end, happened so quickly. And then I was starting to think about what I was going to say in this lecture, and I thought, we're pretty behind as well. I'm behind, because we're in a different kind of revolutionary age, and not in a good way. The challenges to reporting are so great now because history has speeded up. Social media is replacing traditional journalism, and attacks on the press are on the rise. Eric Hobsbawm, the Marxist historian, wrote a book called Age of Revolution, and he was talking about the period of 1789 to 1848. So you have the French Revolution, that's the political revolution, and the Industrial Revolution, that's the technological revolution. Those are the dual revolutions that created the modern age. And then, as now, you only can see the shape of that afterwards. But I think that in Europe and the US, there's another revolution underway, the populist revolution. The French Revolution was caused in part by a debt crisis, and ours, I think, is caused in part by the financial crash of 2008, which who is we? We is the elites, we is the people who do traditional journalism, we is politicians, we is probably many of the people in this room, we underestimated that. We didn't understand. And that's partly because journalists didn't do a good enough job of going out and finding out how this really affected people and how it changed their point of view or towards governments, towards banks, towards all of the institutions of state. And so now we have the rise of Le Pen, AfD, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and of course Donald Trump. More about him later. You think of a revolutionary, what do we think of? Che Guevara in his beret, how romantic. The most radical revolutionary in Latin America now is Javier Milei in Argentina. He campaigned with a chainsaw to say that he was going to take a chainsaw to government. And by that, he meant he's a libertarian. He wants to get rid of all of the institutions. He also, incidentally, this is incidental, he had this English Mastiff called Conan, which I thought was named after Conan the Barbarian, but apparently it was named after an economist called Conan. But anyway, he had Conan cloned, and because Conan died, but apparently he still talks to Conan, so that is particularly worrying that some of the economic policies of Argentina are based on the advice of a dead dog. The political revolution is totally enmeshed with the technological revolution. Of course, that's the digital revolution. So in half a lifetime, half of my lifetime, we've gone from the beginnings of the internet to artificial intelligence. No wonder we still think it's 8:30 a.m. and it's actually already tomorrow. Because these revolutions are symbiotic. It's no longer about who owns the means of production, but who owns the means of communication. Now, I expect a lot of people watched Donald Trump's inauguration, or some of it. I didn't want to go for it. I said no, I couldn't face it. So I watched from behind the sofa, like that. The CEOs of General Motors, ExxonMobil, they weren't there in the front row, were they? Even though he's talked about bringing back manufacturing, and one of his big things is drill, baby, drill. He's going to get back to fossil fuels. No, we know who was there in the front with him. Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg. It's the new titans of this new communication age. And it's not surprising that Trump, has founded his own social media company, Truth Social, because they want to control both the medium and the message. And what's in it for Musk and Zuckerberg? Well, it's quite straightforward, actually. They just don't want to be regulated, do they? They don't want to be regulated. They don't want a government that's going to put any curbs on them making money. I don't think they really have much of an ideology. A lot of them, like Zuckerberg and Mark Andreessen, were very, left-wing in the early days, and certainly Democrat supporters. Not anymore because of the threat of regulation. So why were they at Trump's inauguration? Well, is there a quid pro quo? I won't regulate you if you skew the algorithm to show my ideas more. I don't know, maybe. But it's profoundly undemocratic, because we've always criticized leaders like Xi Jinping and Putin for curtailing freedom of speech. But we see in Trump somebody who favors autocracy. And I see this as a revolution that's likely to create dictators, not bring them down, because politics is no longer a battle of ideas, but a battle for attention. How do you get attention in this age? You get attention by being outrageous. How much attention are we paying to Trump? A huge amount. How much did we pay to Biden? Not so much. How much do we pay to, Nigel Farage? How much do we pay to Keir Starmer? Not a lot, because he's a bit boring, isn't he? He's quite boring. And that's the one thing you can't be in this age of revolution. And so we look at Trump, and he signs all of these executive orders on day one. We don't know which ones matter and which ones don't. It's impossible to tell. And so you're chasing after that little mouse and that little mouse. And look, that one's gone over there. As journalists, it's very hard to know what's important and what isn't in the moment. And then by the time you decide, oh my God, we've moved on to the next thing. I wanted to go back to Syria. And at the beginning of this year, and my editor, who's always right, said, no, I don't think you want to go back to Syria. You can go back to Syria a bit later in the year, but we've got to concentrate on what's happening in America and on Trump. I can't argue with her. She's right, because she's my editor. But also because that is the biggest thing that's happening. But at the same time, it moves so fast that we are being left behind. And so I feel it feels like a car crash in which we're all rubberneckers, aren't we? Just, oh my God, what's going to happen next? I was very interested that one of the things he talked about was Panama, the Panama Canal. He's threatened Greenland, he's threatened Canada and Panama, which did make me remember. Do you remember the last time the Americans invaded Panama? It was 1989, in order to... this is completely irrelevant, by the way, to the theme of the talk. But I just was remembering, because I did a story the other day when I was looking at the history of the Panama Canal. And they went to seize Manuel Noriega, who was the dictator then. It's a democracy now, it's a dictatorship then. And he was a drug smuggler, and he was an appalling person. But it was one of the best bits of non-lethal warfare that's ever been carried out, because he fled to the Vatican embassy, and the way they got him out was by playing full volume Status Quo for 10 days. Come on, you'd leave, wouldn't you? AC/DC. Bruce, I was looking at the track list. Bruce Cockburn singing "If I Had a Rocket Launcher." Well, they had a rocket launcher, didn't they? They were the Americans. And also, of course, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas. You can run, but you can't hide. Anyway, I doubt that it will be quite so benign next time. And the other thing about these tech giants, of course, is that they are all men. And they have no time for women. In fact, I think they despise women. Mark Zuckerberg made that statement the other day about the need for more masculine energy. And the idea of male strength, I think, is very important to these revolutionaries, both the political ones and the digital ones. And one of the main things that propelled certainly Trump back to power was what they call the manosphere of all of these male podcasters who aren't necessarily particularly interested in politics, but they have a vision of masculinity, which is very central to them. And that, I think, that is something that Sue would have really, really hated, and so do I. So what are we going to do? This was the difficult bit. I thought I might get off the stage at this point, having analysed it all. Because it's very difficult to know what to do. I don't think that we should be nostalgic. So you think of the technological change. Look, when I started as a television journalist in Nairobi, we used to record on a cassette, and we used to go to the airport, to the British Airways queue, and I'd say, hello, I work for the BBC, anybody want to take a cassette back to London? And they'd say, oh, yes. And I'd say, oh, great, because somebody will meet you at the airport, and then they'll give you, with your name on a board, and they'll give you a cab into town. Well, we don't do it like that anymore, do we? Now, wherever I am, we have a thing called a live view, which takes 6 or 8 local SIM cards, and through that I can be live from pretty much anywhere in the world. And we have to use this technology, and this technology is brilliant. So you think of something like Bellingcat, who are these investigative reporters. It's extraordinary what they do. Do you remember the 2 Russian secret agents who went to Salisbury to poison the Skripals? No, sorry, they went to admire the spire of the cathedral, didn't they? Sorry, I got that wrong. Anyway, they went there, and we saw their pictures on CCTV. And then these guys from Bellingcat, they sort of combed the internet, and they found, I think it was the football team of the particular branch of the GRU, their bit of the Russian Secret Service. They put the picture of their football team online so they could match up the faces. So this kind of stuff is extraordinary, and in many ways I think that investigative journalists doing this kind of work, and investigative journalists who are going through things like the Panama Papers, which reveal corruption all over the world, I've got so much time for them, partly because there's no way I can do that kind of thing because I don't have the kind of brain. I'm better at standing in front of something, going bang and saying, oh, look at that. But these kind of journalists are really uncovering things which are very important for us to know and will be more and more important because I think we're in for an age of extreme corruption under Trump as well. And also, people are able to film for themselves and put stuff online. We at Channel 4 News employ a brilliant journalist called Kamal Kadora, who is Lebanese, who in the early stages of the revolution in Syria, when Sue was there and Marie and I was to some extent, would be able to go through all of these pictures, what we call UGC, user-generated content, and know whether they were what they said they were or not. I would see something and say, oh, Kamal, look, this has happened. He'd say, no, that's from 3 months ago from a different place. It's become a whole specialism in TV journalism, and that is brilliant. And, Channel 4 News now reaches millions online, and less than 1 million on the TV. So all of that is good. It's a huge new audience. It's a young audience. And that is why, also, when the digital team slide over and say, Lindsey, could you do a TikTok explainer on the Syrian revolution in 1 minute? I go, yes. And I do my best to explain the Syrian revolution in 1 minute. Short attention spans. We all have that problem to some extent. I noticed one of the stories I did from Syria was about Captagon. That's this drug which the Assad family had sort of become a mafia family, really, in the last few years, and they turned Syria into a narco state. And this drug, Captagon, which is an amphetamine, they were exporting it around the region, and that was how they made their money. And I'd done a little work on that, so we went off to find a Captagon factory, and we found one, and it was just extraordinary. One of the most extraordinary things about it was that there was all this plastic fruit, because what they would do is that the pills, they would stuff them into plastic fruit and then pretend that they were exporting oranges. It's just quite amazing. Anyway, I thought it was a rather good piece. 4 minutes, and I was very pleased because I saw that it had been one of the most popular features, one of the most popular stories online. And then I looked at how long was the average length people had looked at the story for, and it was 46 seconds. Oh dear. Difficult, isn't it? But every time I think about that, I think that there must have been, at the time when papyrus was, ceasing to be used and they were going over to paper, I'm sure there was a scribe going, oh, it never lost, because paper, that's no good, is it? I mean, it's so perishable. Papyrus is obviously the best. And likewise, at the beginning of the printing press, there will have been somebody whose job it was, to write out the Bible or to, write letters for people who will go, oh, they're just going to make lots of mistakes, aren't they, now with this printing business? They'll come back to us in the end. They'll need it. So, you have to be careful not to be like that, and you have to take the story to where people are. One of the most popular stories I've done, and I understand we shouldn't always be talking about what's popular, but you want to engage people, was a story I did from Ukraine at the end of 2022, and I was in a trench, and I really wanted to, I was trying to do those thing about, showing the trench warfare and how similar it was to the Somme, which it is in many ways. And look, the story did very well, and it was partly because there was a Russian sniper firing, so it looked like your correspondent might get her head shot off, which is always good. And also because one of the soldiers had a kitten. That made the story popular, but people did watch it, and actually they watched for more than 46 seconds, and through that story we were able to show what it was really like for soldiers on the front line in the war and what their motivation was, which I think was important, and also to talk about that there were soldiers who we couldn't talk to on the Russian line who were 500 meters away who were also in trenches. So you do have to find that way of reaching people. One of the things which I think is really interesting is that there are exceptions to this short attention span thing. One of them is podcasts, and the other one is drama series. So drama series are really important. I mean, Mr. Bates and the Post Office, that did more than, journalists, I didn't have anything to do with it. Private Eye, there was a technical magazine as well, which did a lot of work on it too. They'd done all the basic work on it, but then a drama was what brought it home to people. That's really important. Satire is really important. And podcasts, people seem to have, a lot of appetite for very long podcasts. I don't know if does anybody listen to The Rest is History with, Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell? It's like being at a dinner party with two blokes talking over you and you can't get a word in edgeways, isn't it? Can you pass the salt? But people love it. They can fill the O2. No idea how. I've never been to a dinner party which could fill the O2. But, that's what it's like. And so I think we need to do more on that to try and understand what that is appealing to so many people, and to use it for not just opinion, but for facts and reporting. Live events. People love live events. I've just done a book called I Brought the War. I'm not here to promote my book, however. Here's a copy of it. It's called I Brought the War With Me. It's some of my stories, reportage, and also poetry, poems that I have selected because I love poetry. It's one of the things that keeps me sane. And I find that people love the live event. They want to find out more about how you get these stories, who you are. So we need to do all of that. I think that the other thing that we need to do more is news literacy. So this is a highly educated audience. You know the difference between an eyewitness report, which you see on the BBC or read in the Washington Post, and some idiot sounding off in his garage. But a lot of people don't know the difference. They can't tell. It's all there. It's there on the machine. It's there. And you're flicking through it and you're doom scrolling. And I think that kids are beginning to understand that more, but I think that we should be teaching news literacy, understanding the difference from infant school, from then onwards, because news literacy is as important as any other kind of literacy or numeracy. And we need to find a way also for older people, because, look, it's a confusing world out there. Noise is the new censorship. There's so much noise. And it's also a time of great danger for journalists, because there is so much noise and there is so much people putting out their own message, governments putting out their own message, rebel groups putting out their own message. For governments, the simplest thing is just to not let journalists go. And that's what we've seen with Gaza, that neither the Israeli nor the Egyptian government have allowed foreign journalists in. And our Palestinian colleagues do the most incredible reporting every day. Those pictures that you see on television every day are taken by the bravest journalists in the world. So brave, because more than 150 of them have been killed in this time of war. More than 150, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, and there are other organisations that have counted more than that. And increasingly, we see stories being reported by reporters from the place, whether it's Gaza or Syria or Lebanon or wherever, and that's good, but they need our solidarity, and I think that we should be showing more solidarity with our colleagues in Gaza, some of the best journalists in the world, because they will be coming for us soon. Under Trump, we're going to see a lot of attacks on the press. And we've already seen the caving of organizations. ABC settled out of court a case which Trump brought just before he became president again, which was they had made a mistake. George Stephanopoulos said that Trump had been convicted of rape, whereas in fact it was sexual assault. Now, in this country, Trump might well have won that case. In America, where you have greater freedom of speech, he probably wouldn't have won that case. But they settled anyway for $15 million because they didn't want to have that hanging over them when he was the new president. And they know that he's likely to weaponize the judiciary. So I think the chances of US journalists going to prison, I think it's there, just like in Russia and China. Because I think the distinction between democracies and autocracies is diminishing, and it's dangerous. And then telling the truth is going to be a revolutionary act in itself. Oh, God, when I get to this point, I think, do I want to carry on doing this? All I want to do is read history. All I want to do is, bury myself in poetry and the past. I read a very good history book the other day. It's called The Damascus Events, 1860, by Eugene Rogan, who's a professor of of Middle Eastern history here at Oxford. It's all about this massacre that took place in Damascus in 1860 of Muslims killing Christians, and then you had the Ottoman Pasha who did nothing, and they brought a new one in who was extraordinary, and he sorted out justice and restitution and so on. There were so many lessons for today, and it was all based on these eyewitness accounts, mainly by a guy called Mushaga, who was a Christian convert, who was working as the US Deputy Consul and had kept a diary and had also sent all these messages. Eyewitness. Did I say the word eyewitness? He was an eyewitness. That's how we know about it. That's how Eugene Rogan was able to write this extraordinary account from which we can learn a lot in the modern age. Because that's what it comes down to. That's what Sue did, isn't it? She was always an eyewitness. That's what Marie did. She was an eyewitness. And that's the first point in telling the truth, because Putin and Trump and people are masters of muddying the water, of creating doubt. Maybe this, maybe that, maybe the other. But we have to be eyewitnesses. We have to be there. We have to be there. And that, I think, is the strength of our reporting. Sue was in the room, wasn't she? Female genital mutilation, just horrendous stuff. But she had authority because she was there. She snuck into Myanmar, into Burma, and saw Aung San Suu Kyi and spoke to her. She was there. That was how she got that out. Artificial intelligence, it doesn't create anything new, does it? It just aggregates what's already there. It just pulls it all together. But what we must do as reporters is we must put an extra emphasis on being there and on being there firsthand. Some of the best reporting out of America, I don't think it was really noticed. It was Chris McGreal in The Guardian, because he didn't follow every little thing in the campaign. Oh, the brat summer. Oh, this comedian has said something offensive. He didn't do any of that. He went to Saginaw, Michigan, where he thought that people would probably vote Democrat because it's pretty poor. It's an area where the industrial base had been eroded. Spent 6 weeks there, found out that people actually liked Trump quite a lot, and he wrote about that and why. And so he wasn't surprised when the rest of us were. That's proper reporting. Reporting that takes a bit longer, that takes a bit more concentration, that takes a bit more commitment. Because this is an age of revolution, of people refusing to accept the status quo. And we're not there to accept the status quo, but to report on the changes. And we always say that governments know, they have to know what's going on, because we tell them as journalists. And the historians of the future have to know what's going on, because we were there. Thank you. Thank you. So I think now people are allowed to ask questions, throw bread rolls at me, tell me that everything I say was wrong, and that they've got a better idea. Is that right? Is that what happens next? Okay, we've got somebody there. Be kind.
No, I'd definitely be kind. I was very interested in what you were saying, because this morning I was listening to The Rest is Politics, US. No, US. So not the two guys talking.
Oh, Catty and Scaramucci.
Who are much better. They've got a great dynamic going.
They have a great dynamic. They were totally wrong on the predictions of the election, but do go on, yes.
Okay. Well, one thing I heard on that which kind of shocked me was Catty Kay has a source who tells her that Mark Zuckerberg is actually worried about going to prison.
Is he now?
This is why he's sucking up to President Trump.
Oh,
because
really?
for the last election, that Facebook was too pro-Biden in some people's view. But, my real question is there going to be a lot more self-censorship in the world generally?
Yeah. No, I think it's a good question, because I think there is. I think there's going to, I think there's going to be a lot more self-censorship because of fear, because what you're talking about there, I don't know whether that's true or not, but that is born of fear. So there is going to be a lot more self-censorship. And so that's what we can't do and what we mustn't do. And that's going to be very hard. And that's why I say I think journalists are going to go to prison. More journalists are going to go to prison. Because if you don't self-censor. Now, of course, I say that, blithely. And of course, it's much more complicated than that. And because, you are a journalist and then you deal with your editor and then you deal with the person who owns the newspaper or the television station or whatever it is. There are layers of responsibility here. But yes, I think that self-censorship is one of the greatest dangers of this age, definitely.
Thank you. That was really, am I turned on?
Yeah.
Really, really interesting. You talked about news literacy. Well, we're not quite there yet, and there's a huge amount of misinformation.
Yes.
How are we going to deal with that, particularly with, the big tech bros taking off any restraint at all? And there we are trying bravely to do something in this country, but actually it's all worldwide. So how do you think we're going to deal with misinformation?
Well, I look that is, that's the essence of the problem, isn't it? And I don't have if I had an answer, I would be much more rich and powerful than I am. So I don't have an answer. I suppose the only thing that I know is to hold on to what we think is right and what we think is true, and to carry on reporting with the standards that we believe in, standards of objectivity, but to try and make our reporting such that it does cut through, that it punches through the noise and that people want to listen to it and to read it and to watch it. But I don't have a simple answer. I suspect that there will come a point where people start to rebel against all of the noise and the disinformation, and people will start to look for other sources. I don't know when that will be or how that will be, but I think that you're never going to go back to a situation where you had a sort of a broad culture which everybody agreed on, where, in the same ways we were never going to go back to, the 1950s where everybody sat down to watch, the news on the BBC and there was no alternative. It's never going to be like that again. So the best we can do is to report as well as we can and as honestly as we can, and just try and find ways of punching through.
Hi, thank you very much for an interesting talk, and thank you also for being one of the people who runs towards the danger when others run the other way. My question is, given that that's what you do and where you go, you've mentioned poetry as a way to relax, but how do you clear those awful images from your head, and how do you keep going back when you know what you're going to be facing? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, yes, the poetry is a big thing. And I found that poetry is a big thing for other people as well. One of the reasons I did this book was because at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I was there, I was in Kramatorsk, and I was trying to make sense of it, and it was hard to make sense of. So I found myself, doing what I always do, which is read poetry. And I started to tweet out a poem a day. And I got a lot of reaction and people wanting more. And then I got to the point where I sort of run out of poems that I knew, and I started to look for others. And then I found a whole world of poetry out there, of Ukrainian poetry and Syrian poetry and all sorts I didn't know. And that was the genesis of this book. So that is definitely part of it. The other is, I have a very small North London garden, which I am thinking of entering for the Chelsea Flower Show for the category of largest amount of money spent on smallest space, for plants that sometimes survive and sometimes don't. But look, I do a lot of, I wouldn't say that I'm the world's greatest gardener. I'm very good at pootling around the garden. I'm good at snipping rather than heavy-duty weeding, I would say. I don't grow anything sensible like vegetables. I just grow flowers, things that are beautiful. So that, I think, is really important as well. And, yes, of course there are dangerous things. But the other thing I have to say is one of the things which I like most in my life is the camaraderie on the road, is working with the team. One of the things which, in my early days, I was freelance and I was spending a lot of time, I would go around by myself. And now one of the things I really love about my job and working with Channel 4 News is that I'm always working with a team. And, that joint endeavour, there is really nothing that feels better than that. And that's why when we're in Lviv and we hear that something's happened in Damascus, we just want to go. We just want to go because we all want to go and we want to go together. Yeah.
Thank you. You hear a lot online, at least, about Britain and the rest of Europe following American trends. Is this something you can see in terms of attitudes towards journalism? And has social media accelerated this process or impacted it at all? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that things from America, we always seem to, get the worst of America, don't we, coming here, and not necessarily the best. So yes, definitely. The trends that you see in journalism there, you see them coming here as well. But I think that there is also some resistance because we have a different media landscape. And certainly I think that our television has always been of a much higher quality than American television news. I would not say the same for newspapers. I think that the American newspapers are brilliant and generally much better than the British newspapers. But yes, look, social media changes the landscape here as it has done there. And we're all, on both sides of the Atlantic, we're struggling to deal with this new age of revolution. Yeah, there's a gentleman over there.
Thank you very much. Can you explain why Prince Harry and the Sun newspaper network settled out of court when Prince Harry was saying he wanted accountability?
No, I can't, because I didn't cover the story and I know nothing about it. One thing I don't do is the royals. Because I'm not interested in them. They're not interesting. I mean, I don't really cover this country. I mean, of course I'm aware of things that should go on in this country, but it's not my mastermind special subject.
You rightly said that the spotlight is off Syria a little bit at the moment, because obviously states.
Yeah.
How's the regime shaping up? Because I feel like that's slightly got lost.
It has got a bit lost. I think we're in a state where we don't quite know. I mean, it's been very interesting to watch Giuliani, the leader, now called Ahmed al-Sharaa. When we first got there, he was in his fatigues with his long beard and so on, and the beard's got sort of shorter and shorter, and now he's wearing quite a sharp suit, I think, at one point, and a tie. So he's obviously getting some good media advice in that sense. And I think, look, it's quite interesting in that you saw them. What do they want? They want, and what do the people of Syria need? They want recognition in the world because they are, HTS is, which leads the new government, is designated as a terrorist organization because they were formerly jihadis. Some people would say they still were. And people of Syria desperately need aid. I mean, it's a terrible endemic poverty at the moment, and all of the institutions in a state of collapse. And so, interestingly, when I was there, I went to see I saw the guy who was in charge of civil service, who had been one of the administrators in Idlib, which was the part of Syria which they controlled, rebel-held part when Assad was still in power in Damascus. And they were getting all the civil servants back again. And they said, yes, we're going to employ, apart from particular ones who were especially loyal to Assad, all the sort of middle and lower levels, they were getting them back again. And one of the things he said to me when the interview was over, he said, well, what do you think we need to do to get recognition by the British government and so on? Because they understand that they need that in order to get the money that they need to try and get the whole place going again. And they did a couple of things very early on which went down very badly. For example, they said they were changing the school books. Now, initially, it was just going to be to get rid of stuff said about Assad. Fair enough. And then they said they were changing things to make them more, Islamic and so on. And then there was a big fuss in Syria from Christians and different sections saying no. And they said, okay, sorry, whoops, my bad, we're not going to do that. And I thought that was really interesting because any new government, in whatever situation, is going to make mistakes. Oh, did that happen here, by the way? And so do you double down or do you say, okay, we did that wrong, we'll try better. And they have done that to some extent. So I think that that's quite an encouraging thing. But, we're talking about a large country with so many different interests and sects. And then we've also the neighboring countries. Israel's taken a bit and Turkey has its own particular interests and so on. So they're navigating in very, very, very choppy waters.
Hi. As you know, Sue started her career at ITN.
She did.
I was her editor.
Oh, marvellous.
I was always right.
Absolutely.
But I was not allowed to send her anywhere dangerous, or any of the women.
Oh, fuck's
I
sake.
just wonder what's the revolution that's taken place that's allowed people like you and others to be what you are?
Nobody has ever said to me that I can't do something because I'm a woman. I think we just proved ourselves. I mean, in the days, look, there was a point when a certain broadcast organisation which I worked for, which will be nameless, but which has 3 initials, 2 of which are the same and they're very near the beginning of the alphabet. When I worked for them, and in this country, and they wouldn't send me anywhere, and they wouldn't give me a correspondence job, and all of those jobs went to men, I just left and went freelance and took myself. And then in the end, they didn't have a lot of choice but to take some of my stuff because I went to places where other people weren't and where bad things happened. My father used to think that I actually caused the wars and the revolutions. But, so bit by bit, we have proved ourselves because it's like any kind of power. They're not going to give it to you, are they? You have to seize it. And so we did.
Lindsey, thinking of... Hello. Hi.
Yes, hi, Isabel, yes. And one of my... it's not up there anyway, but one of the previous and much more erudite speakers.
Nonsense. Wonderful talk. I just thinking of your Damascus and Washington connection. One of the things that can happen in a revolution such as we've just seen in Syria is that all the police files suddenly come to light.
And that has happened, yes.
So I wondered whether the name Tulsi Gabbard had currently the nominee for the FBI,
yes.
Very highly thought of in Moscow and indeed in pre-revolutionary Damascus, might have surfaced and what you might think of her nomination.
Yes. No, well, I haven't seen anything. I suspect that she's very much a sort of a bit part player in Syria. I mean, as you may remember, Tulsi Gabbard is a slightly eccentric politician who was Democrat and is now Republican and who Trump has nominated as his head of national security, which is above, I think it's above the FBI and the CIA, sort of above all of it, which means she doesn't actually have that much hands-on day-to-day authority, which may be a good thing. But she controversially went to Syria and met President Assad and so on. I mean, she was, one of Lenin's useful idiots. And, I mean, she hasn't been mentioned. And, I can't imagine what it would be like to be a CIA agent at the moment. I'm thinking, if you spend your whole life trying to guard against what you have been told and what you believe is the enemy, which is, now Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, and to some extent China, and so on, and you're doing quite subtle things. To have these very unsubtle and contradictory things put on top of you, I suspect there's going to be a lot of resignations and a lot of early retirements. It's extremely difficult.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's been quite stimulating. So I'm over here.
Where are you? Over there, yes, hello.
Right. Can you just delineate what are the advantages and disadvantages of being a woman in your field?
Being a woman. Okay. On the whole, it makes no difference. It's no more dangerous for a woman than it is for a man. The shell that killed Marie killed Remy Oshlik as well. It didn't discriminate. So I don't think it makes very much difference. I think that sometimes in particular parts of the world where men and women live quite separate lives and where women are shielded from men, sometimes the male correspondents can't go and talk to the women, and we can, provided we speak the language and have a female interpreter and so on. So in that sense, I think being a woman can be an advantage. But obviously, you can't... It would be wrong to discriminate against the men because they can only get half the story, whereas we can get all of it, wouldn't it? Sarah?
Given that Washington, D.C. was in your title. I'm thinking forward with anticipation 1,450 days on the eve of a certain president's second term. And I'm asking you, what will be the state of states? What states will not exist anymore? What new states might we have? And generally, your prediction on what might happen. Sorry, it's a bit of a tough one.
So you think I'm a prophet, not a journalist?
I think you're amazing. And,
I'm not that good. Look, one of the things that we learn as journalists is always to hedge any futurology, don't we? So that you can never say that we were wrong. So I'm going to take a pass on that. But I think that, that we may well see a transformed Europe. I think that Europe is in a difficult situation because of the rise of the far right, and obviously the country which is fighting for its life at the moment is Ukraine. And I think that you're not going to see that Ukraine doesn't exist anymore. I think Ukrainians, when I was last there, Ukrainians have a different attitude at the moment than they did, back in 2022 or back in 2014 when I first went there, in the sense that they were like not an inch of our territory. I think now there is an understanding that they may have to temporarily accept that they do not control all of their territory. That doesn't mean giving up their territory to Russia, because by the constitution they can't do that. But, there are facts on the ground. But a lot depends for Ukraine on what security guarantees they get in exchange for that. And they need security guarantees which mean that when, and I say when, I don't say if, the Russians come back again after a ceasefire, that they will be protected. And that needs to be by NATO countries. Now, I don't think that President Trump is going to go for that, because he doesn't really believe in NATO. So then it's really going to be up to Europe. And I also think Turkey will be a very important country in this. And we're going to have a buffer zone and peacekeepers. But certainly if we're looking at different states are going to be in 2 or 4 years' time, Ukraine is the country which I see in the most danger in terms of its borders and so on. Can I have a drink soon? It's not that I don't want to answer your questions, I do.
Bearing in mind the danger that embedded journalists have, how long do we think Steve Rosenberg is going to be safe in Russia?
Oh, Steve, isn't he wonderful? I absolutely love Steve. He's not only a fantastic journalist, but also a brilliant musician and pianist. I mean, it's just incredible. He's so talented. Look, he does an incredibly fantastic job on treading that very difficult line, living, reporting from inside a dictatorship. And I don't quite know how he does it. I think that there's a lot between the lines of what Steve reports. And, if you can understand some of the subtlety of what he says. But he is also really, he called it a war from the beginning, not a special military operation. He still does it, he tells truth to power, and he says it like it is as well. And I just hope that he gets to stay there as long as possible, because we need him a lot. Yeah, there's a lady at the front row there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lindsey, for really a great talk, a great lecture. I wanted to come back to your point around there being an increase in local journalists reporting, and just wondering, is that a trend? Is that we'll see increase further? And two, you also talked about us needing to have solidarity for them, and I wondered if you could say a bit more about that. Is it because they are in such danger? Just elaborate a little bit.
No, absolutely. So this gives me a chance to promote one of the things I'm involved with, which I love, which is the Marie Colvin Journalist Network. So when Marie was killed, Marie was always very generous with her time and with younger reporters, and particularly women. And so Lise Doucette, who's also been a lecturer here, and Jane Wellesley, who was Marie's best friend, and I founded this organisation called the Marie Colvin Journalist Network, where we provide support to female journalists in the Arab world. So we have 13 in Gaza, we have journalists in Syria, in Lebanon, in Egypt, all over the Middle East. And the support they need varies. It's a network, so they provide peer-to-peer support to each other. Mentorship, we have a whole bunch of mentors who are all Arab journalists who have a lot of experience, mainly women, because most of this is taking place in Arabic, not in English, so there are some. I mean, I'm a mentor to a Sudanese journalist, and we speak English because I don't speak Arabic. Hostile environment training, counselling when necessary, because some of them are in very difficult situations. Sometimes emergency grants, because people need to leave a country very quickly or leave a house very quickly because they're in danger. But a lot of it is about being part of a network where they support each other, because sometimes the opposition to them doing the job comes from family members. It's not just the governments or the rebel groups or whatever. And we've found that this kind of support, it's quite low-key, has been very effective, and that they really appreciate it. And we try and stick up for them as much as we can. And I think that all of those organizations like that can do a lot. But in the broader thing, in countries in Africa, across Africa, when I first worked in Africa, which was back in the 80s, there were African newspapers and so on, and people, coming up. But the BBC Africa service, it still had, Wazungu, white people at the top. That's no longer the case, because all of these skills are there. And this is, again, a good thing about the technology, right? That the technology has spread a lot of things across the world. So in those ways, I'm very encouraged by what's happening in journalism, because I see so many fantastic Arab and African and Latin American journalists, far more than I did at the beginning of my career.
Thank you. You talk about the importance of being there and seeing things for yourself, but what about if you're not a journalist or diplomat and say places like, for example, Russia, where it has got far more difficult to visit in the last 15 years or so. I was last in Russia and Ukraine in 2006.
Well, that's why we need Steve Rosenberg, isn't it?
Yes. Yes. Well, I'm unfortunately not Steve Rosenberg.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult to find your way through the thicket, and I understand that. Because of the noise, because there's so much information out there. And I think that one just has to. That's why I come back to news literacy and just sort of learning to discriminate, and you have to put a little effort into finding out what you think are reliable sources and understanding. I mean, the BBC Verify thing, it's a bit clunky, but I don't think they're wrong in trying to sometimes explain the workings of how we get to what we broadcast, of how we got to understand what we do and what is.
But actually, physically being in the country and visiting.
Yeah, well, for people who are not journalists, something I can say about that. I mean, you can go to where you can go to and not to where you can't. But from a journalistic point of view, we just have to fight as much as we can to try and to get to everywhere we can. And one of the things which is good, as I said, is that all these national journalists coming up, which means that when we can't, there are always people there.
Thank you.
Hi. All these national journalists and people like you do the work on the ground. How are we going to finance independence for
the business model? Look, that's a really good question. I so wish I had an answer to it, because that is one of the biggest problems is the financial model. So, Channel 4 News. We have a contract with, we're produced by ITN, which provides a news service to Channel 4. Now, Channel 4 doesn't get any government money at all. It has a government mandate, but unlike the BBC, it doesn't get a licence fee. So it's basically funded by advertising, and we all know how difficult that is. So the advertising model, both in television and in newspapers, is extremely difficult at the moment. Now, you've got, increasingly in America, you've got things like ProPublica, which is an investigative news outlet, which I think is really good, and that is funded by philanthropy. Now, you have more philanthropy in America than you do here. But those kind of different models, we're going to have to look at more and more. I mean, we don't know whether the license fee will continue for the BBC. As far as I'm concerned, it works. But I understand that governments may not continue to do that. So all of this is exercising brains much bigger than mine. All I do is hope there's enough money to send me back to Syria.
I was just wondering, is it on? Yes. I was just wondering how you saw the issue of intervention and R2P, the responsibility to protect, developing from now, because of course Iraq made it very unfashionable, let's say, but I believe that you believe, as I did, that the intervention in Libya was the right thing at the time, because otherwise it would have been much worse. And now we see that a dictator is got rid of by the people themselves in Syria. So I was just wondering whether that has undermined any appetite for intervention and R2P.
Yeah. Look, I don't think there is any I don't think there is any appetite on behalf of governments for intervening in R2P responsibility to protect. It was an idea of its time. It was distorted by the intervention in Iraq, which was on false pretenses. It was pretending to be a responsibility to protect when it wasn't. And so I think that sort of knocked it on the head, and then Libya came sort of limping along at the end. But I think that one of the things which would be really interesting to see is whether the success of the revolution in Syria, the fact that they overthrew the dictator, primarily without intervention. Now, of course, I understand that they're backed by Turkey, and it's not as simple as that, but more by themselves than by outsiders. Whether that will make it more enduring and more stable, that's one of the things that we'll have to see. But I'm not expecting to see outside countries, particularly European and American countries, intervening anywhere on humanitarian grounds. President Trump might intervene on other grounds, such as, that's a canal I fancy. But it's going to be like that, I'm afraid.
Lindsey, you have given us an absolutely wonderful lecture this evening, and you've expressed a wish to be able to wet your whistle. So on that note, I take the responsibility of calling this formal part of the question and answer to an end with a huge thanks. But actually, at St Hilda's College, we always ask our students to show us how to do it. So if you move a little bit towards me, then you can leave everything, that's fine.
I'll leave everything.
You leave everything, that's fine. And I'm going to ask our JCR president, Melinda Tsu, who's studying PPE at the college, to give you a vote of thanks. Melinda.
Thank you. No pressure after that introduction and that wonderful lecture. As someone who's been eyewitness to so much, thank you for physically being here with us today. You've given us an expert account spanning Damascus to Washington, D.C., but also podcasts and TikTok and the Chelsea Flower Show and much else besides. As a politics student, I found it fascinating how you connected all of those dots. As someone who consumes the news, I feel rather called out for my attention span. But as a collective we, thank you for clarifying the important aspects that we should be paying attention to, especially when history speeds up. And so in memory of Sue, thank you for giving this wonderful lecture, and thank you for being here together today in legacy of Sue, who has brought us together.
Just before I allow you all to leave, as it were, to progress to having a drink and eventually the dinner, it's my great pleasure to draw your attention to the first ever Helen Grindrod lecture that will take place in about a month's time, again on the theme of women and protecting women and vulnerable people. So please also note this for your diary, should you be remotely interested. Professor Jane Monckton-Smith will be giving the lecture, and we'd love to see you back here then. Thank you so much, Isabel, Lindsey, rather. No, not Elizabeth, Lindsey. And please, let's go. I need a drink too, clearly. Thank you.